Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Cosmos Society interview with Suzanne Lye. Suzanne is assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Having initially started with organic chemistry and antibiotics, she moved to classics and is now working on a project about conceptions of the afterlife in the ancient Greek world, underworld narratives. And she's also participated in digital humanities initiatives through Harvard's Center for Hellenic Studies, including the Homer Multitext Project. And she was also a fellow at the Center for Hellenic Studies last year. And she has interests in Homeric reception, Greek literature and culture, mythology, gender ethnicity, and classical reception. So welcome, Suzanne. Thank you so much for coming on to talk to us today about teaching and learning Greek. So, Hélène.
Yes. Hello, Suzanne, and I'm very happy that you are joining us for this interview. So how do you decide on the curriculum, and what textbooks do you use and why?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. I love talking about teaching. I love teaching. I love thinking about pedagogy and how to connect, because really teaching is about connecting with students and meeting them where they are. And in terms of, so my students come from all different backgrounds. And one of the main things I do when I'm thinking about teaching a course, whether for the first time or the fifth time, is what do I want the main takeaways of the course to be? Like, what do I want people to own as their knowledge about the ancient world? And then go into the world with that knowledge to be able to share it, or to be, to share their excitement about it. And so I often start with, where do I want them to end up? And what do I want to be the main takeaways for them? And then from there, I then decide on which texts to use. I generally prefer to use primary texts and then have the students react to the material directly without the intermediary, sometimes of a textbook, but sometimes I do supplement with a textbook or articles or secondary literature to say, here's how people are thinking about, this same primary source that you just read. And so I welcome students to, just read the primary sources first, and then we talk about first of all, what happened in it? What was the plot? And what things did you think were strange or weird or charming or delightful? And how would you interpret it? Like, is this how you would act in that situation? So I sort of try to get them to connect to the characters and to the story patterns. And then we might introduce like a text, like a passage from a textbook or a secondary literature to show them, well, this is how scholars think about it, knowing a lot of other things than what we just read. And that's how we generally in the field think about it, but your reaction as a student is also valid because that's how you're taking it in.
So it sounds as if you're working mainly with primary text. It's not like one of these intensive courses that sometimes students have to undertake to sort of cram learning Greek to start with. Is that right?
Yeah, well, so when we're talking about language learning, so I like to make learning fun and playful because I think that actually works better for retention if you associate the learning, or you don't actually realize you're learning because you're having so much fun. And so I have taught intensive courses, and I do teach Greek courses regularly. And one of the things, like learning the morphology, the paradigms, things like that a lot of Greek students, they have to know. I tell them there is a lot of memorization because you need those to be able to do the fun stuff faster. Now, you don't need to learn all the vocabulary, but then you have to look up every single word, and it just slows you down. It kind of bogs you down. So it's more efficient to learn the concepts and the vocabulary and the morphology so that you can get the enjoyment parts. And I tell them I want them to get to the enjoyment part. Like the reading is kind of like the dessert, perhaps, of the meal. But I also help them with different tools that they can use for learning. And so I tell them, it's better to do 5 minutes of flashcard review every day than to do, 20 cards like an hour before you take the exam. And so I say, just try to build it up like it's a habit. Whatever study patterns you do, build it up as a daily habit that you stack on top of current habits you have. So for example, you can brush your teeth in the morning and then review 5 vocab words, or have them, pasted on your mirror. And, or maybe that's, you have them, 5 a day or 5, depending on how fast you're going. And then some other activity while you're eating lunch. You just go through 5 at the end of lunch or the beginning of lunch while your meal is heating up in the microwave or something. And so you kind of stack your study on top of other habits that you have. But yeah, I'm pretty intensive when I teach. I think like that's when you get the best reward. And most of my students, I think, they've worked really hard to get where they are if they're in college, the ones I teach. So I said, I know you're not afraid of hard work. So because that's really rewarding. So let's work hard and we will get the rewards.
Hi, Suzanne. What about digital tools and technology? How do you incorporate them in your teaching?
Well, thanks for that question. I like to, as I said, meet students where they are, and a lot of them are quite proficient at digital tools. And so most recently, I've been using a lot of games in my classroom, like both board games and video games, and have the students bring them to me. So, well, with flashcard review, I say like the method that I used was just index cards or pieces of paper that I could move around and manipulate. But then, there are all these online flashcard things, and I tell them, of course, you could probably find the set of flashcards for our unit, but the best way to learn the vocabulary is to create your own flashcards, even if it's on a digital like Quizlet or something like that, or Anki or something like that. So I say the best thing to do is to create your own flashcards, because part of the learning is while you're creating the flashcards. And so, so I use them that way for all of my classes, whether it's Greek or otherwise. I like students to get a sense of the world that the people lived in, because then they, especially in Greek, then they get a sense for why certain vocabulary are privileged over others. So when you learn Greek, you're learning vocabulary that if you were learning a modern language, you wouldn't learn that vocabulary, right? Like you wouldn't learn all the things about war and farming and things like that. If you learned a modern language, you'd probably learn colors and numbers first, when in Greek, you learn that quite late. And so, they need to understand the world they live in. So lately I've been using games, like video games. So like, Assassin's Creed, Odyssey, they have a discovery mode for teaching, so they can take a virtual tour through the ancient world.
What sort of students do you have? Are they mainly those taking classical studies, or those from all disciplines?
They're from all disciplines. I will say I'm pretty proud of the fact that after my class, or after actually all of our professors' classes, we're in my department, people usually add a minor in classics, if not a major. So I think we have a good team of instructors at UNC that really, we're very excited about the material, and I think we're able to convey that enthusiasm. So I teach some first-year seminars, and those students haven't chosen a major yet. And so I have a chance to move them in the way of classics. They've never heard of classics. And so I show them what I do and I introduce them different courses they can take in my department. And a lot of them do end up taking more courses. Some become minors and some actually become majors. In my Greek language class, I would say maybe half are majors, and the other half are doing it for a requirement, to fulfill their language requirement. But they become such good friends with their cohort because they meet 4 or 5 days a week sometimes in the first year, that they want to keep going with Greek or keep going with Latin. So yeah, it's a mix. So, but for my general education classes, I can't assume any previous knowledge of the ancient Greek world.
Right, and have they, some of them, previous experience of learning other languages, or Latin, or even modern languages, and how does that affect their ability and your ability to teach them a language like Greek?
Well, most people have not had experience with Greek. Most of them have taken a language like Spanish in high school. And so they've taken English classes as well, so they know some grammar. Latin sometimes, but rarely. So we start kind of from scratch.
So how do they cope with a different alphabet? Because that's the first thing. Oh, this is different.
I think that's like week 1. So it's pretty exciting. And we say, memorize this overnight. Some of them are familiar with the Greek alphabet from math. And so we connect it like, oh, you can use this in different disciplines. It takes a few weeks for people to get used to it. It takes longer for them to get used to reading it. So even though right now I'm teaching intermediate Greek and make the students read aloud and they're very halting with it, but I think they'll gain proficiency. But they like it. They feel like they know secret code.
Do you have any top tips for people learning Greek, whether they're studying it in a class or if they're studying on their own?
Well, my first, with a language like Greek, which is, you have to learn how to learn it. Like I always recommend doing it formally with an instructor, whether it's an individual tutor or through an online course or through a local course. I think it just saves you a lot of time. So I have a lot of students who have studied it on their own and come into my intermediate level, and that's fine. But they, they're really smart. They're really good at memorizing, but they miss some, like when you have an instructor, they'll give you, like the textbook never tells you everything. And so, and there's no textbook that's perfect. And so having somebody who knows the language, I would recommend that actually in every language. This is what I found in every language, because I've studied some languages just for reading or some to be able to speak it or to travel in those countries. And I think in the early stage, having an instructor helps give the foundation to be able to go much faster later. So you can do it on your own, but my recommendation is to find an instructor, find a course online that has an instructor explaining things.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Suzanne. That was really interesting, and there's some useful information there about engaging with the subject and with the language as well. So thank you very much indeed. And, bye for now.